Ladies and gentlemen, there are times in life when we lay out our plans, chart our course, and set our dreams in motion, only to watch them crumble before our eyes. The door we prayed for does not open. The opportunity we counted on vanishes. The path we walked so confidently is suddenly blocked. And in that moment we ask, why? But what if I told you that the destruction of your plan is not the end, it is the beginning? What if the very thing you thought was a loss was actually God's divine redirection? We often believe that our plans are solid, that our dreams are the right path for us, and that we know what is best for our lives. We make decisions based on what we see, what we desire, and what we think will lead us to success, happiness, or fulfillment. But the truth is, no matter how carefully we craft our plans, no matter how much effort we put into making them work, there is a higher purpose that overrules everything we do. God's purpose is not subject to our desires, timelines, or expectations. His purpose is eternal, unshakable, and perfect. When we set out on our own path, we often forget that God sees what we do not. He sees the end from the beginning, the dangers that lie ahead, the pitfalls we cannot detect. What seems like a perfect plan to us may be leading to destruction, disappointment, or something far less than what He has prepared. Because of this, God will not always allow our plans to succeed. He will intervene, redirect, and even allow failure to bring us into alignment with His greater design. Many are the plans in a person's heart, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. This means that no matter how much we plan, no matter how much effort we exert, it is God's will that determines the final outcome. If our plans do not align with His, they will not stand. Sometimes this is painful. We may feel as though our dreams are being crushed, our ambitions wasted, and our efforts in vain. But what we often fail to recognize in the moment is that when God dismantles our plans, He is actually protecting us. He is leading us towards something greater, something beyond what we could have envisioned for ourselves. Consider a man who works tirelessly to build a career, believing that success in his field will bring him happiness. He studies, invests time, and sacrifices much to reach his goal. Then, suddenly, everything collapses. The job opportunity vanishes, the promotion he expected goes to someone else, and he is left in frustration and confusion. He may wonder why God allowed such a loss when he worked so hard. But what if that very failure was God's way of steering him toward a higher calling? What if the path he was on would have led him away from his true purpose? The destruction of his plan is not punishment, it is redirection. God's purpose is not always revealed in the moment. Often, He allows doors to close without immediately showing us the door He is opening. This is where trust comes in. Abraham was called to leave his homeland without knowing where he was going. He had to walk in faith, believing that God's purpose was greater than his own understanding. Joseph had dreams of greatness, yet he was thrown into a pit, sold as a slave, and imprisoned. His plans were shattered, but God's purpose was unfolding through every step. We often resist when our plans are disrupted. We fight against what we do not understand. But if we truly believe that God is sovereign, that He is good, and that His purpose is higher than ours, we must also believe that when He overrules our plans, it is for our ultimate good. Our role is not to cling to our own desires, but to surrender to His will, knowing that His purpose will always prevail. Even when we do not understand, even when the road ahead is uncertain, we can trust that God is leading us exactly where we are meant to be. There are moments in life when we set out with confidence, believing that our plans will bring us success, joy, or fulfillment. We structure our lives according to what we think is best, making decisions based on our own understanding. Yet, despite all our efforts, there are times when everything falls apart. The path we were walking suddenly vanishes. The opportunities we counted on disappear, and the dreams we work toward are shattered. It is in these moments that we are left wondering why. Why did everything we built come to nothing? Why did God allow our plans to be destroyed? The truth is, when God breaks our plans, it is not out of cruelty, but out of love. He is removing what is not aligned with His will to redirect us towards something far greater than we could have imagined. From the beginning of time, God has operated not according to human plans, but according to His divine purpose. When people move outside of His will, He intervenes. When they choose paths that lead away from His best, He disrupts their course. This is not punishment, It is protection. What we see as loss, he sees as rescue. What we view as failure, he sees as preparation. A plan that is not rooted in his will may seem good in the moment, but in the long run, it will not stand. When God removes something from our lives, it is because he knows it is not part of the greater story he is writing. The scriptures provide countless examples of people whose plans were destroyed by God so that his greater purpose could be fulfilled. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, likely believing he was destined to use his influence and position to help his people. But when he acted in his own strength, killing an Egyptian, his plan crumbled. He was forced to flee into the wilderness, where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. To the world, it may have seemed like failure, but in reality, God was preparing him for a far greater mission. The man who once relied on his own power had to be broken so that he could learn to depend on God alone. Jonah had a plan for his life, but it did not include preaching in Nineveh. When God called him, he ran in the opposite direction, setting his own course. But God sent a storm, breaking apart Jonah's escape plan and had him swallowed by a great fish. It was in the depths of the sea that Jonah realized that his plans could not stand against the will of God. What seemed like a disaster was actually his salvation, because through it he was brought back into alignment with God's purpose. Saul of Tarsus had a plan to destroy the followers of Christ. He was convinced that he was doing the right thing, that his mission was just. But on the road to Damascus, his plan was shattered in an instant. A blinding light knocked him to the ground, and he was left in darkness. His entire world was turned upside down. Yet in that moment of brokenness, God was not destroying him, he was transforming him. The man who sought to silence the gospel became its greatest messenger. In every case, God was not punishing, but redirecting. He was taking something away, not to leave them empty, but to fill them with something far greater. The destruction of their plans was necessary for the fulfillment of his purpose. What they had built had to be torn down so that God could establish something that would last. It is the same for us. When God removes something from our lives, we must trust that he is not taking away our future, he is protecting it. When everything around us seems to be falling apart, when the plans we once held onto so tightly crumble before our eyes, we are often left confused and disheartened. We ask why things didn't work out the way we envisioned, why our efforts were in vain, and why the path we were so sure of suddenly came to an end. What we often fail to recognize in those moments is that what appears to be destruction is actually preparation. What looks like a setback is often a setup for something greater. God never allows something to be taken away unless he is making room for something better. Throughout Scripture, we see this truth unfold time and time again. Joseph had dreams of greatness, of being in a position of influence, but his journey to that destiny did not happen the way he expected. He was betrayed by his brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned for a crime he did not commit. If anyone had a reason to believe his life was ruined, it was Joseph. But what seemed like repeated failures were actually divine preparations. The pit was not the end, slavery was not the end, the prison was not the end. Each of these painful experiences was leading him to the very place God had destined for him. Positioned to save countless lives, including the very brothers who betrayed him. His plans were shattered, but God's plan was being fulfilled all along. Moses' life followed a similar pattern. Raised in Pharaoh's palace, he was in a position of privilege, power, and influence. Perhaps he believed he would use that position to help his people, to bring about change from within. But when he killed an Egyptian and was forced to flee into the wilderness, his plans came to an abrupt end. He spent 40 years in obscurity tending sheep, far from the life he once knew. To anyone looking from the outside, it would seem that his story was over, that he had lost his chance at greatness. But the wilderness was not a place of exile. It was a place of preparation. God was shaping him, humbling him, and equipping him for something far greater than he ever imagined. The man who once relied on his own strength would become the man who would lead an entire nation out of bondage, not by his power, but by the power of God. What seemed like a loss was actually the foundation for his true calling. Then there was Paul, a man zealous in his mission, convinced that he was doing the right thing as he persecuted followers of Christ. He had a plan, a purpose, a clear direction in his mind. But on the road to Damascus, his plan came to a sudden and violent halt. Blinded by the glory of God, he fell to the ground, unable to see, unable to continue on the path he had chosen. In that moment, everything he thought he knew was stripped away. He was left in darkness, helpless, with no choice but to surrender. But in that place of brokenness, God was not punishing him. He was transforming him. The man who once sought to destroy the gospel would go on to write much of the New Testament and spread the message of Christ across the known world. His plan was destroyed, but God's purpose prevailed. In each of these stories, there is a pattern. What seemed like destruction was actually preparation. What appeared to be failure was actually the hand of God, shaping, refining, and redirecting. When our plans fall apart, it is not because God has abandoned us, but because he is preparing us. He is leading us through the process necessary to equip us for the calling he has placed on our lives. If we only look at the loss, we will miss the greater purpose behind it. But if we trust him, we will see that what was taken away was never meant to be our foundation. His purpose was always greater. There are moments in life when everything we have worked for seems to fall apart. The plans we carefully put together unravel, and the doors we thought would lead to our destiny suddenly close. It is in these moments of confusion and disappointment that we question why things are not going the way we expected. We wonder if we made a mistake, if we missed an opportunity, or if we are being punished. But what we often fail to see is that what looks like destruction is actually God's way of preparing us for something greater. When we experience loss, failure, or sudden change, it is easy to believe that things are going wrong. But God operates differently than we do. His ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are beyond our understanding. What we see as a setback, he sees as a setup. What we view as a failure, he uses as a foundation for something far greater. Sometimes he removes things from our lives not to harm us, but to protect us from paths that were never meant for us. He does not allow anything to be taken away unless it is part of his divine plan to give us something better. Joseph's life is a powerful example of this truth. He had dreams of greatness, but before those dreams could come to pass, his life seemed to fall apart. He was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, and later wrongfully imprisoned. Every step of his journey seemed to take him further from his dream, but in reality, every moment of suffering was a necessary step toward his destiny. Had he not been sold into slavery, he would not have ended up in Egypt. Had he not been imprisoned, he would not have been in the position to interpret Pharaoh's dream. The very things that seemed to be setbacks were the events that led to his promotion as second in command of Egypt. What others intended for harm, God used for good. Moses also experienced this kind of redirection. Raised as a prince in Egypt, he may have believed he would deliver his people from oppression through his own strength and position, but when he killed an Egyptian and was forced to flee, his life took an unexpected turn. He spent 40 years in the wilderness tending sheep, far from the power and privilege he once knew. To many, it would seem like his life had been ruined, but God was using the wilderness to shape him into the leader he was meant to be. If Moses had remained in the palace, he might have relied on his own strength. But in the wilderness, he learned to rely on God. What looked like a loss was actually preparation for his true calling to lead the Israelites out of Egypt by the power of God, not by the power of man. Paul's story is another example of how God disrupts plans to fulfill his greater purpose. Before his conversion, Paul was known as Saul, a zealous Pharisee who persecuted Christians, believing he was doing the right thing. He was on a mission, confident in his path, determined to carry out his plans. But on the road to Damascus, everything changed. A blinding light stopped him in his tracks, and he was left helpless, unable to see. His plans were instantly shattered. But in that moment, God was not punishing him, he was transforming him. The man who once sought to destroy the gospel became its greatest messenger. His former life had to be broken so that he could step into his true calling. God's plan often requires seasons of breaking, waiting, and refining. When we encounter obstacles, delays, or failures, we must remember that these moments are not the end of the story. What seems like a loss is often the very thing that is positioning us for something greater. If we hold on too tightly to our own plans, we may miss what God is doing. But when we surrender and trust that his purpose will prevail, we will see that every closed door, every unexpected turn, and every moment of difficulty was leading us exactly where we were meant to be. There are moments in life when things do not go as planned. The dreams we pursue, the goals we set, and the expectations we hold on to sometimes fall apart before our eyes. In those moments, we question why everything we worked for seems to be crumbling. It is easy to feel frustrated, lost, or even abandoned, but what we fail to realize is that sometimes the very plans we make must be destroyed so that we can step into something greater. God does not break our plans to harm us. He does it to realign us with His purpose. When we set out on a path, we do so with limited understanding. We see only a small piece of the picture, while God sees the entire masterpiece. We make decisions based on what we think is best, but God knows what is truly best for us. There are times when the path we choose may seem good, but it is not God's best. He will sometimes close doors, block opportunities, and bring disruptions into our lives, not to discourage us, but to redirect us. What we view as disappointment is often divine protection. He removes what is not meant for us so that we do not settle for less than His perfect will. Throughout Scripture, this pattern is clear. Joseph had dreams of greatness, but his journey to that destiny did not happen the way he expected. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and later imprisoned. If anyone had a reason to believe his plans were destroyed, it was Joseph. Yet, every setback was actually a step forward in God's plan. Had he not been sold into slavery, he would not have ended up in Egypt. Had he not been imprisoned, he would not have been positioned to interpret Pharaoh's dream. What seemed like destruction was actually preparation. God was not breaking him, He was building him. Moses experienced a similar redirection. Raised in Pharaoh's palace, he might have believed he would use his influence to help his people. But when he took matters into his own hands and killed an Egyptian, his life changed in an instant. He was forced to flee into the wilderness, where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. From a human perspective, it looked like his destiny had been derailed, but God was using that season of isolation to shape him into the leader who would deliver Israel. The palace was never meant to be his place of power. His true calling was found in the wilderness, where he learned to depend on God alone. Paul's story is another powerful example. Before his encounter with Christ, he was convinced that his mission to persecute Christians was right. He had a plan, a purpose, and a clear direction, but on the road to God stopped him in his tracks. A blinding light caused him to fall to the ground, and he was left completely helpless. His entire world shifted in a moment. Everything he believed in was shattered. Yet this breaking was necessary for his transformation. The man who once hunted down believers became one of the greatest messengers of the gospel. His old plans had to be destroyed so that God's greater plan could be fulfilled. When our plans fail, it does not mean we have failed. It means that God is working behind the scenes, preparing us for something we cannot yet see. What looks like a loss is often the very thing that will position us for the next step in our destiny. Closed doors are not rejections, they are redirections. We may not understand in the moment, but in time, we will see that every delay, every obstacle, and every broken plan was actually an act of grace. God's purpose will always prevail, and when we trust Him, we will find that His plan is always better than our own. There are times in life when we believe we are on the right path, following the plans we have carefully crafted, only to see them suddenly fall apart. The opportunities we counted on vanish, the relationships we relied on break, and the goals we worked so hard for seem to slip through our fingers. It is in these moments of frustration and confusion that we begin to question why things are not working out. But what we fail to see is that sometimes God Himself is the one breaking our plans, not to harm us, but to realign us with something far greater than what we could have imagined. We make plans based on what we see, what we think is best, and what we desire. But our vision is limited. We do not see the full picture, the hidden dangers, or the greater purpose that God has prepared. What we believe to be the best path may actually be leading us away from His will, and because He loves us too much to let us settle for less, He will sometimes intervene, disrupt, and even allow what we built to fall apart so that He can establish something greater. What looks like a setback is often divine redirection. What seems like destruction is actually protection. Joseph's life is a testimony to this truth. He had dreams of leadership, but his journey to that destiny was nothing like he expected. Instead of rising to power immediately, he was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Every step seemed like a step away from his calling, but in reality, it was preparation. If he had not been sold into slavery, he would not have ended up in Egypt. If he had not been imprisoned, he would not have been in the position to interpret Pharaoh's dream. What seemed like years of suffering were actually steps leading to the fulfillment of God's plan. Moses also experienced the breaking of his plans. Raised in Pharaoh's palace, he may have believed that he would use his influence to help his people, but when he acted in his own strength and killed an Egyptian, he was forced to flee to the wilderness, where he spent 40 years as a shepherd. To many, it may have seemed like his life had taken a tragic turn, but God was using that time to shape him into the leader he was meant to be. If Moses had remained in the palace, he may have relied on his own strength. Instead, he learned to rely on God, and it was from the wilderness that he was called to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Paul's story reveals the same pattern. He was a man with a mission, determined to silence the followers of Christ. He believed he was doing the right thing, but his plan was shattered when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus. In an instant, his entire world was turned upside down. Blinded and helpless, he had to let go of everything he thought he knew, but through that breaking, God transformed him into one of the greatest messengers of the gospel. His former plans had to be destroyed so that he could step into his true calling. When our plans fail, it is not because God has abandoned us. It is because he is working behind the scenes, redirecting us towards something greater. The things we cling to, the dreams we refuse to let go of, may not be what is truly best for us. And because he sees what we do not, he will sometimes take things away, not to hurt us, but to protect us. Every closed door, every unexpected turn, and every broken dream is leading us to his purpose. When we trust him, we will see that his plan is always better than our own. Thank you for watching.